Hello and welcome back to the video. Next video in the series. Basically what I want to do here, after looking over some of the things we've created, the discovery and the information, I think I want to clean it up a little bit because I found as when we imported the 192 space that it imported as private, and I don't want that to appear that way. I want it to kind of appear in a different way, and I want to go ahead and fill in some of the other gaps so that when we do run the discovers and we do start importing information, that it's more like how we want this to be in the ends when we start managing this. So a couple things I want to do is add more block types. So I want to go ahead and start adding um, some video, make this part of private. And here I want to go ahead and start adding the additional containers here where I want this to be allocated. And I want this here to be a valid block type, and I don't want that to be allocated from there, and I want this to use subnet. Let's do another. Um, let's do one more. Management. And we'll make this part of private. Okay, and just for the types, I'm going to go back and just validate a few things here, make sure our policies line up, so that when we get down into the valid block types here, I want to have data management, video, VoIP, wireless, which is correct at this level, and then at this level I should have the same. And our allow allocation should be from private. Actually, I want to change these. I don't want this to be set here. I want this to be private only. And this should be private only as well. So those policies do only allow for the allow, so it didn't set this up for us the way we anticipated there. Okay, so that should be good. And let's change this here as well, as I believe we'll have to do the same. Okay. And so now we should have our root block here, the 192.168. And so what I wanted to do effectively at this phase was to add in some additional data and additional IP addresses. So I wanted to add in that the data network in the manual, and I'm going to sort by IP address so that I can get these properly listed. And I want this to be the 192.168.0.0, and I'm going to create a 22 so I can demonstrate the split functionality. We're going to keep the name, set it up as subnet, and in the policies, we'll go ahead and define just a few things here, since these are all going to be standard. Okay. And this is then going to define our /22 subnet. And then I want to go into here and do a split. And I want to do 24 equal parts. And that should define the, 0, 1, 2, 3. All right. 3 I don't even need because it's not on there, but we'll keep it there just for the case of it. And these are now data blocks, which are exactly what I have set up in my lab. So now if I go back, and I can do two things. I can either run the snapshot again, going back to the router discovery we performed, and in that discover, then run that import snapshot difference here. And this will then import those subnets or basically attaching those to the router. Right? So I should have two errors, the two errors were the 172 and the V6, and we expected that. Now looking back at my device, you'll see here now that I have on Ethernet 0, they're now data blocks, they're in their proper block type, and also in their interface. So that's how I wanted that to be displayed, so we've cleaned that up, that looks good. And again, to explain what that happened is we had the root block here at private. There was no other intermediary block type, such as data, wireless, VoIP, and therefore it was not assigned that capability, and so we used the only block type it knew, which was private. and that's what we had in that case. Now, a couple other things I want to do here is I want to add a couple user-defined fields. These are going to be the things that we're going to use for the templates and different types of fields. One of the fields that I use, especially in automation or several, is going to be one I call API enabled. So I'm going to have the display, which is how this is going to appear in the web interface. And then from the field name tag, this is how it's being referenced in the database and also in the import files and also APIs in terms of reference or queries. The type of field here, I want this to be a radio button, and I want this to be on and off. I'll go to the defaults here. Okay, and I want that to be allocated to, let's say, the subnet UDF, which we're going to attach to the subnets. That will then enable this API, or enable an API if I do this on there, and it'll appear as a field. So because I already have the subnet template defined to that, if I go back to a subnet, we should see it if it's part of the subnet. And I must not have attached it. So let's do that now, make sure we have it associated. And let's do it here. Maybe I have it assigned here. Okay, I do not. So let's go to Management Container Maintenance. And let's just make sure our block type policies are set properly for subnet. Okay, actually it is enabled. I just didn't see it in with the other radio buttons there. So when I go back and look at my subnets now, there is a radio here. So this, it's kind of hard to see that, but that API enabled, we do on or off. And the way I use this in my programming is that for subnets that are enabled, it allows me to control which APIs or subnets are available to the APIs. So I use this particularly, but there are a couple others that you probably definitely want to use in terms of contacts or other information. So here, again, we can go back in and define some others such as VLAN ID. So let's do VLAN name. We'll just make this a standard text. We'll put it on the subnet, and we'll do a few others here. VLAN ID. And let's do point of contact, email. We'll do name and then email. All right, and what else we want to add here? So we might want to maybe set up a different field, like an HTML field. And we do have the ability through a URL type that you can specify a template that builds the URL dynamically based on underlying fields, such as Google Maps or something based on an IP address or subnet or something like that. Like, it's a little bit more complex, so we may have to come back to it, but I think we have a few fields here that we can kind of see the idea and concept. so that as I navigate again to the subnet, and as I'm either adding or modifying, underneath the standard field, you'll see these fields enabled as they're in a block type is defined based on the container policies. So we've got a little bit more fields here, and we can start doing things like, we might say this is VLAN 100, and I might go in and change all of these. So I'm going to go ahead and give it some numbers here just so I can have something to reference when we get to the API discussion. And we'll turn this one off. We'll call this 300, 400. All right. Okay. Now, the way that the fields are organized is through the container maintenance for the blocks or for the individual IP addresses when you get into a subnet. The container fields, when they're defined, will appear in the details if they are specified. But you can also have subnets appear by adjusting the information template and selecting which fields should appear. So if we go to the tools information template list, I can enable that, say the VLAN ID, and I might then want to have POC email address as a reference. And if the fields are addressed or defined anywhere else where they're established, I'll then see the fields, their VLAN ID, and the contact information. So let's kind of fill that in a little bit. Now, the other things that we have are the custom types, and you certainly may want to go in and adjust these or modify these. You should leave the unknown and unspecified. These are kind of defaults, and I don't think they allow you to delete them, so you do want to keep these. So you can modify or add your own. And when you define these, you then have a naming policy which can be applied at the time of allocation. Now, what's important with this, if you don't want everything to have a specific name, or your servers or printers or routers, if you want to use automation and if you want to use the naming policy in the automation, it's wise to go ahead and set these up ahead of time. And the way this naming policy works is it's based on a free text, some information you might be able to add or subtract to it, and from there. So I'm going to do on my servers, I'm going to do SRVR below, and I'm going to do an incrementer just to make this very easy. And we'll do dash separated IP address. Right? And I want to do the same thing with printers. We'll do, say, PRN. I want to know what their IP is. And let's do one more for PC. And routers already have one. However, I might want to shorten that a little bit. I might want to call this just RTR, and I do like the IP, so I'm going to keep that in there. And the others, we may or may not use. IP phones, we might do as well. Let's see, we might want to just do phone. Okay. Now, the reason I'm saying that is, again, there's a naming policy for importing IP devices, or if IPControl doesn't have a host name, there is a way to auto-generate names, and it's generated based on this device type, so that as you go into an IP address assignment and you select the type, it'll have a suggested name for you. And to demonstrate that, we'll just do quickly server. So our suggested host name now is SRVR, it's IP and subnet and name. Now, of course, if you're doing it based on IP address, you're going to have to change things if you move them around. So you might want to use other incrementers or other types. But just for, in setting this up in an automated way, as we'll get to eventually, this is one way to do that. Okay. Now, you'll also notice that there are no user-defined fields here at the IP address level because we did not assign any to the information template. However, I can go now into the device or down to an asset, let's say the server, and I can append any of the existing devices. So I can go ahead and assign the POC name and email, and then I can have these displayed with the IP addresses when they appear in the subnet list, or other fields as you seem fit. So remembering and keeping an idea that the user-defined fields are controlled through the template and they appear, based on their allocation. And as you select an IP address with the settings in the uh, containers and you select that type, those user-defined fields then become available dynamically on the screen. Right. So we filled in some of those details. What else we have? So we have some policies, and this will maybe take a little while to go through, but let's try to get this out of the way. The policies themselves kind of dictate a lot of the user-definable aspects of the tool in enabling and disabling features, and/or setting up some limitations, at least around exporting devices or how much data a user can access. Right off the top, everything is obviously user sortable here, but you have initially some about links. And these about links are links that you can customize that appear on the portal page when everyone logs in. So there's a kind of globally defined policies. We can allow for admins to be assigned as master users externally. Right now, they're only based on the internal database authentication, so that losing their password, you have, access and ways to reset it. The allow block from allocation, we've already changed. The same container, we define that. If you're having any kind of dot notation in your host names, and I don't recommend doing that. It causes issues when you try to import if you're not managing those subdomains. Preferably, you should set up subdomains versus dot notation if at all possible. But if you have to do this, or for backward supportabilities, it is enabled through a policy, as well as the ability to set up some DNS checks like duplicate CNAME owners, allowing underscores in the host names. The overlapping block support is by private by default, but we support public by the policy. The auditing of records are all turned on by default, so that any changes in the API or through web interface, etc., are audited, and they're all available underneath the reports audit menus. So we're going to do this so we can see these. The block folding threshold, if you get a lot of subnets imported, you tend to have this, what we call folding process, to reserve performance, or conserve performance, if you will, so that as you add more blocks, we'll fold these up at X number of IP blocks. So every 500, we're going to kind of group them together with a heading that you can then expand, like the container tree view. I prefer to have them standard listed out, and if I have more than 5,000 in a container, I should probably reorganize that. So that's a number to look at, but anything over that or within there might impact some performance, but not too much. Some other checks here for the passwords and so forth. And the areas that we're going to get more, I guess, kind of allocated to is the externally authenticated admins to automatically create those users if, let's say, you're using Microsoft Active Directory, role-based administration, and then when the users log in, if they don't exist in IPControl, but they're in your Active Directory domain that you validate, we'll go ahead and create them and assign them to the role. So it's a great way of actually monitoring your permissions through AD, enabling the administrator by that domain membership and its permissions by that domain membership. Otherwise, they go into a default group that gives them, say, read-only or even denies them access. So we can do quite a bit with this. And I'm going to enable it because I think we'll get through a video to show that here soon as we get into the external authentication videos. There are some other values here you just kind of have to play around with, such as the dynamic address thresholding. By default, when we do snapshots of data for history, we'll start with 90 days. You can change that to another value. Actually, the 90-day here. For the ping check, we can do an ICMP ping or an TCP 80 ping over TCP. We'll use ping only. We'll assume that's enabled. Others here that you have for stop on warnings, you can force it to stop. in terms of how you deploy configurations and checks and validation. You know, we're going to default that everything, some defaults here that you can maintain. Now there is also, and I'm going to get into a whole video on this series of callouts when we get starting to get to APIs and command line interfacing and external interfaces to IPControl. There are transactional callouts that allow you to do other things, like when I add a subnet, send an email to a group that then does something with that data, or to an automation process that emails it. Or if you look at, say, some of the workflow capabilities, which we'll go through, we can set up DNS workflows and have a process of emailing back and forth approvals and pending approvals. So there's a number of things that we can get to in this series, I hope, but knowing that the policies are here, and we'll kind of try to step on those and show how these work. So I am just going to enable it for this process so that you can see how this works initially. And I'm just going to enable all these. Now, in terms of the copy method, when you're using the Sapphire appliance, this is relatively easy because we do all of the settings up front. We recommend you go ahead and establish an SCP user. And then when we do the login, we would set up to use a default login that has permission, which is the Inc admin for the shell. And it's going to route to the home user of that, or directory of that user, which is by default where we need access to the files on the appliance. If you're installing this on Linux, you would have to define this as your home user for your user, or you would have to change the password file to specify as home directory. We route to this automatically to opt and control FTP route, so it works out very well. So STP, and that gives you then port 22. If you do FTP, it uses a built-in user you define here, and it uses 8021. Now, external authentication is something that we do want to establish where we can talk to an Active Directory, TACACS, LDAP, Radius, etc. And we do have some external scripts that we provide that support some of this functionality. Now, I have modified my file, and I already have this working, and I have an Active Directory environment. So I already have a script that's out here available that I'm using. So I'm going to go ahead and use it in this process, and we may have to come back and go through this video in a little bit more detail to go over that. But basically, I'm going to tell it to run, it's based in Perl, so I'm going to tell it to run my file. Which is this, and then I want to go ahead and test this, and I want to use my test user. And that came back negative. So let me go take a look at my script real quick and see what's going on there. Okay, and what it was is I was editing it on the wrong server, which if you're editing that file and making changes, make sure you're on the right executive. So this file exists on the IPControl executive, just so we know that. And there we go. So I do have success. Now what this represented basically is that this user I'm using, it talked to our Active Directory securely over LDAP-S, and I have a Kerberos server there, and it authenticated the user. Now, this particular user in the test, which I'm going to go ahead and we're going to save this user. Let's go ahead and complete the setting, and I'm going to go show you this. So we're going to save that. We're all good with the file managers here. The force change password value, we don't have to do that. Set this to admin readable, at least for the containers, if you want to restrict this by user. And maximum number of records, if you want the users, when they're exporting data, you can restrict how many records. Obviously, you don't want them exporting hundreds of thousands every time, so you can say 5,000 or something along the lines. The restore capabilities, there's a counter, and the minimum is 50 records or maximum. If you want your administrators to have more than that by default, maybe 100 records, this would give you 100 IP addresses in the list that could be restored by deletes. I changed my ping attempts to 2. The polling is fine. SWIP is fine. Numerical's correct for that. The IP address, if you ever change the IP of the executive, The task manager runs by default on the IP control, so the server here, and also the executive IP. These are two areas you'll need to change the IP address. And we are eventually going to get to the resource record workflow, so I'm going to go ahead and keep that there, and we'll go ahead and view that with the galaxies. A lot of policies we changed, but a couple things I want to go over real quick on the script. In the sense of the administrator definition, when I log in, the only user I have here is the Inc. admin, but when I log in as this user, with that external creation, make sure I can type this right, it will automatically create this user because I've associated it to a template that I can then import and tell it to auto create the IP. Okay, so I got this worked out, and something I should have set up previously, but I'm going to go back to it now. The first is in the policies, the user I'm using is a super user. So it's in a particular group that my script allows it to be imported as a master. So basically what that means is I had to go back in and turn this policy on that if you're going to automatically import master equivalent users based on their external domain authentication, you need to have this set to yes. Right. I had that to no, so it would not allow it to be logged in as a master. Okay, so I'm going to save that. The second thing is you want to make sure you have a default role. So a role is a group of permissions, or you add users to these roles and they inherit permissions. So you should set up a default, whatever you're going to have, and I use default role as spelled this way. And I set up the policy so that there really are no policies enabled for it. I want this to be read-only effectively. They come in with normal access. They can't do anything until someone else approves them at that point. You know, just as an example to show you the extreme cases here, right? So down on the login, the first time of this user login, now that I am a master user, when I log in the first time, that user is not created, it actually imports and defines the user. So I now have under admin administrator, I have IPAM user, super user, and if I click it, you'll then see that it's authorized externally, that it's managed externally, and that it's enabled its master and super user, right? So that's based on that Active Directory information that we set up. Now, if I change that real quick, and I'm going to just do that and take my user out of that group, and if I try logging back in again with the right username, all right, and with the right password, I'll then again be logged in. And this time when I go take a look at that administrator definition, I took them out of that role, and their role in IPControl now reflects what's in Active Directory. From the other configurations here, I talked about allocation reasons. You know, there's not much here, and I don't have any permissions on this user, so let's go back to the other screen where I do. So let's take a look at the allocation reasons, and these are those reason descriptions. You might want to put in maybe, you know, number 101, this is new subnet request. We can then say 102 is new VM IP, something along those lines, so that you have the ability of setting these codes, and you can then, as you provision subnets, select that information from those descriptions, give it a reason, and then the code also gets assigned to the audit reports where you can see it, track on it, audit it, and so forth. Okay, so I think we've carried on with this video about 30 minutes. I think is the most I want to keep these. I hope you got some additional information here and how we cleaned up and some of the other details about the user-defined fields. And I think in the next steps, we might go through some additional API settings, kind of show you what that information looks like. You know, maybe a quick intro into the CAA coming up soon, the automation appliance, and others. So once I decide those, I'll get back on the next video and hope to see you on that one. Take care.